Thank you very much for the kind invitation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present how we see the pandemic is affecting the food system with all the complexities that were described by you before. So let me first start by, we divide the problem in three phases. The first phase is what we call the containment phase, which is basically the period of the lockdown. And why is this so important? Because if we try to decompose the channels of transmission of COVID-19 into the food system, and this is an oversimplified version of the food system framework that you presented from the CFS, the Committee of Food Security. The first phase basically affected initially the food supply through logistical issues. Essentially, there was effects over the fixed capital access, over intermediate inputs, and over labor. And the effect changed depending on the commodity. So you had the staple commodities, which are rice, wheat, maize, corn, and soybeans, and those are capital intensive and they are not perishable. So the effects over those commodities was not so complicated. The only part was the logistical part of moving the commodity from the harvest to the ports, for example, in the case of key exporting staples. But in the case of the high value commodities, the problem were a little bit more complex because of the logistical issues, and especially because of the labor. They are labor intensive and that require people to work, and also people were not working because of the lockdowns, but also because of health issues. They were afraid of going to work, and that created significant complexities in the high value commodities. Now, this uncertainty in terms of the commodities and what was happening created some reactions, and those reactions are reflected in trade, especially in the US, which is a key staple exporter. And what we observed was that some countries started to overreact, like the case of Russia, which put an export quota, which although the quota was big enough and basically respected the same level of trade that they had before, it created an incorrect signal, which was later on followed by Vietnam in rice, which also put an export quota, which created a constraint in terms of prices. The prices start to increase in the Thai rice variety because it's a very thin market. Now, the reason of the quota of Russia was because of another channel, which is a macroeconomic channel, the exchange rates. So the dollar became a strong currency, and the more the crisis progressed and the lockdowns progressed, countries start to dollarize, and therefore they become this affected the exchange rate, and there was a devaluation, which made it more attractive for exporters to sell everything they had. And that's why Russia had to put the quota to avoid all the wheat coming out of their country. Now, that is the first phase, but of course there is a follow-up to that, which started at the end of the lockdown, which is more an effect over demand, which I will explain later. But that's the second phase, which will be affecting the demand over these agricultural food systems. Now, what is important is that if we look in detail to the situation of staples during the first phase, there were sufficient stocks. The level of stocks were close to double what we had in 2007, 2008 during the food price crisis, in both maize, wheat, rice, and in corn. Now, what is tricky and where we need to be careful is that the major increase in the stocks comes from China. And these are the orange bars in these three graphs for maize, wheat, and rice. Although at the aggregate level, we had significant stocks. So that told the market, look, there are stocks, and we had a very good harvest in 2020, and therefore there was no reason for panic. The only uncertainty was the logistical part. And that logistical part is what created these export restrictions. Initially, we had a maximum of 16 countries putting export restrictions on staple commodities, which meant around 6 to 7% of the global share of global trade. But if we compare that to the 2007 and 8, we have 33 countries, which were around 28% of the global trade. So initially, with the 16 countries, still we were significantly lower than we had in 2007 and 8, which meant that there shouldn't be any overreaction. But we had to stop this, because if these continue to grow, then we could create a crisis when there was not a crisis, because there were sufficient stocks and there was a very good harvest. Luckily, because of the information shared by the EMIS system and the information shared about the availability of stocks and the good harvest, many of these countries removed their export constraints, starting with Vietnam, which removed it on the 1st of May, and then Kazakhstan. And as a result of that, today we only have 11 countries putting export constraints with very small share of the global exports, which is around less than 2%. So today there is no issue in terms of trade, which is reflected also because the logistical problem was resolved. If we look at real-time vessels mobility, we see that vessels are moving with no problem. So there is really no reason why we should have a problem today, and this number of countries putting export restrictions should keep lowering down. Now, this moves us into the second phase, and the phase which we call the consequences. And this is very linked to what was presented before, and it's essentially the result of the lockdown and the reduction on production and value added, and what we call the demand shock. The IMF, a few weeks ago, in April, they presented their outlook, and their outlook was saying that at a global level, there will be a reduction of GDP growth of -3%. That's a significant change from a positive of 2.9. Even they were thinking a 3% positive for 2020. Not only that, in the US, for example, the growth will be negative in -5.9, in euro area -7.5, even in Latin America -5.2, and Africa will, after a decade of growth, will go down to -1.6. So this situation is what we are concerned in terms of what we call the consequence, because this will create a significant reduction in demand, and will create the problems that we heard before, that there will be farmers that couldn't move their production because there is no demand, in addition to the logistical problems that they were facing in the high value commodity. Now, if we look at around the world, how this reduction in GDP growth is distributed, we still believe that the IMF estimations are very conservative, in the sense that they are expecting Asia to keep growing, they're expecting many countries in Eastern Africa to keep growing, and some countries in West Africa. What we are observing in Asia, in China, is that that's not necessarily the case. China will grow, of course, but at a very lower rate than what was expected. Even the recovery is a lot slower than what we were expecting initially. India is going in significant trouble, so we don't expect also the recovery to be as fast. And Eastern Africa and West Africa are very vulnerable because they depend on primary exports, and the price of the commodities, or the primary commodities, are going down, especially oil, which is affecting key countries in Africa. So this recovery in 2021 is not clear. The IMF was expecting a significant recovery. Now we are thinking that in 2020, we will be around -5% of GDP decline, and we don't expect that the recovery will be so fast in 2021. So we're moving in a period of a U-shaped recovery with a longer base of the U, which again brings a significant problem. And why? In terms of food security, this map is bringing what we use as food crisis countries. These are countries that are in IPC 3 or higher. This is the measure that we do to assess the severity of food insecurity in countries. Now, as you can see, most of them are in Africa. In Latin America, we have in Ecuador, Venezuela, and Colombia, and also in Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and of course, Haiti, and some in Asia. But the important thing is that despite this, if we look at another dimension, what we call the structural vulnerability, and we assess all the channels of transmission of COVID-19, and we rank 6 vulnerabilities in red, yellow, and green. And taking into account the red vulnerabilities, the ones which are critical, which we call here very high or high, which is the dark blue, we see that many countries will experience potential problems because of COVID-19 or food insecurity. Example, Brazil, which is right now going into a serious problem of COVID-19. Even Peru, which was one of the earliest to try to cope with COVID-19, is facing significant problems. And in Africa, of course, in addition to the food crisis countries, which are in the circles, in the orange and red circles, many countries will expand. What this tells us is that the number of food insecure people will keep growing, even in different places than the traditional places that we identify through the food crisis because of conflict or because of other issues in history, which have been always a food crisis countries. Not only that, if we look at the labor force in the food systems, we have around 1.2, 1.3 billion jobs in the food systems across the different elements of the food system, which imply around 3 billion livelihoods, households, people. Now, of those, because of COVID-19, 32%, 451 million, are at risk. And that implies around 1 billion people at risk because of COVID-19. Now, remember, these are formal jobs. These are not informal. If we add to this the informal jobs, that will be a significant number. And in the developing countries, the informal jobs are extremely high. But not only that, when we look at the decomposition, most of the effect is in the food processing, in the food services, and the distribution, 60% across them. Why is this important? Because most of the food processing in most of the high-value commodities is mainly done by females, which creates this imbalance between females and males. So it means that these sectors will be affected, and it will affect more jobs of females than males. Primary production effects are not so big, it's 21%. But the distribution and the processing will be significantly affected, and that's what we are seeing in the meat processing plants that have been closed, in many of the packaging plants that are being closed, and so on and so forth. So again, that's something to alert, and it's something to understand that a third of the jobs in the formal sector are at risk. We tried to do some simulations, and we have been very careful on numbers, but we took a database that we developed on net food importing countries, and we tried to model different scenarios. An optimistic scenario of a 3% reduction in GDP growth, like the IMF, a mild scenario, which is a 5% reduction in GDP growth, and a pessimistic of 10% reduction in GDP growth. Today, we believe we are in the mild scenario, and we could be moving into the pessimistic if we have a second wave of COVID-19, which the probability every day is higher. Now, in the mild scenario of 5%, we're talking of 38.2 million only in food, net food importing countries of undernourishment increase. In the pessimistic scenario of 10% decrease in GDP growth, we're talking of 80.3 million people. Remember, today, FAO number says that we have 820 million people undernourished. So this will increase even more significantly the number of undernourished people. And if we look at the Human Development Index, we see that the effects of the pandemic are substantially higher even than the food financial crisis, the financial crisis. Why? Because the financial crisis was in developed countries. What we are observing today is across the world, and it's affecting, of course, the most vulnerable in developing countries, because the most vulnerable don't have the resources what the US had that has been shown before, where you can do all these additional mechanisms to support farmers. That cannot happen in Africa because they are indebted, they don't have the liquidity. Even in Latin America and in many other regions, it's very difficult to have such a system and such an infrastructure to be able to support farmers. Now, which are the places of the world which are the most vulnerable? One is the small development islands, states. Why? Because they are based on, the resources are basically because of tourism, which has been stopped abruptly and won't be open for the next 12 to 24 months. Second, they depend on remittances, which are reduced substantially, 25%. And third, they are net food importers, and also they are very vulnerable to climate. Next to them is Africa. Why? Because in Africa, first of all, the countries in black here are countries which are net oil exporters, like Nigeria, like Chad, like Libya and Algeria. All of those countries have been substantially affected because of the fall in oil prices, which means that they don't have the liquidity to get food or to get the imports that they need. Not only that, countries like Mali, which are exporters of cotton, has been increased because the contracts of cotton has been stopped. The same affects Bangladesh, for example, in South Asia, which lives on clothing industry, which has been completely stopped, creating significant unemployment. But also in Africa, you have a lot of key commodity exporting countries which are being affected. Even coffee, which was growing at 2.5%, is now supposed to grow at 0 or negative. And Ethiopia is a key exporter of organic coffee, Arabica coffee. So the capacity of Africa to be able to have the resources to be able to import what they need to import has been restricted enormously. It is true that the G20 has agreed to exonerate the payments of the debt for 2020 for the IDA countries, and that helped, that released a constraint. But still, all these shocks to the continent will affect them. Although today, the level of COVID-19 is very low in this continent, but we don't know it is because of lack of testing. We hope it is low, really, but if not, situation could be very dramatic in this country. Small islands, as I mentioned, are affected in 4 dimensions, but just to cover the 2020, they need around $5 billion of liquidity, which is not too much, relatively speaking. Just Peru asked $11 billion to the IMF, but they need this only for 2020. And unless tourism is reactivated because of the presence of a vaccine, they will be struggling substantially. As I mentioned, tourism has collapsed substantially. It's collapsed in 2020, and we expect this will continue for 2021. And this also have affected flights, which also affect the cost of transportation for high-value commodities. Because high-value commodities that transport through air, like asparagus, for example, or fish, they share the cost with the passengers. If there are no passengers, then the costs are higher, and they are not profitable to be exported. Commodities will be falling, as I mentioned, the price of commodities. And of course, we will see, and we are seeing, a significant decline in the price of oil, which is historically low, and this is affecting key oil exporting countries. Finally, remittances. The World Bank has estimated that there is a reduction of 25% of remittances, which means that countries that depend on remittances will be significantly affected. So the second phase for us is a phase of contraction, is a phase of access, lack of access to food. So food will be available, and food is available today. The problem, as a result of what we are describing in the second phase, is that there is an access to food problem, lack of income to buy the food that you need. And that will create a significant problem at all dimensions, for consumers for sure, for nutrition for sure, because we can end in increasing consumption of low quality food and not healthy diets, and that will increase overweight and obesity. But also it will create a problem for farmers, because what they produce won't have the demand they used to have, especially from the northern part of the world. And that could result in significant increases in losses, which is a problem, and also lack of liquidity for them to continue to the next planting season. So this put us in the third phase, health, food, and development triology. For us, it's crucial to have this triology. Why? Because although people are moving and countries are moving out of their lockdowns periods, the problem has not been resolved. The vaccine is still not there, and the level of COVID-19 is still high. And if we don't keep the health protocols in place, we will no longer have a lockdown by decree, but we will have a lockdown because of health. And that's what we observe in the meat industry in the US, and we have observed in the ports in Brazil and in other key exporting countries. So if we are not careful and we don't put in place all the protocols of health, the situation could get worse. And then it's not an issue that the government is saying lock down and don't go to work. It's an issue that you cannot work. Look what happened in the last month in the wholesale and retail markets in Latin America, especially in Peru and partially in Chile. They had to close the markets because 70% of the employees in the wholesale markets were with COVID-19. And there was no option to replace them. It took them 3 weeks to reopen the markets. And this will continue to happen if we are not careful. So today we have not won nothing yet. There is a lot to do. But what are we doing in terms of food and development? Because that's what we need. We need to take this as an opportunity to also bring changes that we couldn't do before and to assure food access to people. So in terms of food access, we need to target the most vulnerable populations. And that's where emergency food assistance and nutrition interventions and safety nets are crucial. We used to have school feeding programs, but now the schools are closed. So we need to find alternatives. And the work of the food banks have been crucial for this. But we need to assure emergency, we need to have good data on where the new hotspots will be. And we are trying to collect close to real-time data using our food insecurity experience scale of what is the level of food insecurity through 8 questions using cellular phones that we tested in China during the crisis. That will allow us to see the deterioration of food insecurity because of this lack of resources to access to food. But we need to use all the possible tools we have available to be able to expand our safety nets and to assure that food access is there for the most vulnerable people and for the most vulnerable populations. Also, we need to work on increased food availability. Because if we are able to resolve, assume that you have the resources through multilateral organizations or through governments, depending on you are a developed or developing country, and you create this demand because of vouchers or because of cards to buy food, and the supply side is not there because of the landlock or of the lockdowns they have reduced and they have not promoted planting season, that will be a problem. Then we will have also a problem of food availability. So we need to find ways to increase productivity, to assure that the next planting season is there, to minimize post-harvest losses, and to remove any constraint to domestic mobility of goods, and to promote e-commerce in agriculture, which was one of the major solutions for China. Now, one of the problems here is that if we want to promote production and harvest, and that's what we are doing in Africa, for example, we are telling the countries and the governments and the Ministry of Agriculture, let them go and do their harvest, let them do their planting according to the crop calendar. So we have developed a tool with the crop calendar to allow them and tell them where they can go out before the lockdowns go deeper. But that's not enough, because if they harvest and they don't have a market because of the recession, what are they going to do with their commodity? And that's where we are trying to work with African governments to define optimal locations of storage, what we call mobile storage units. Together with the World Bank or entities, we're trying to set up these optimal locations. And here the circles indicate those optimal locations, which are based on an algorithm where we optimize access to markets, distance to ports, distance to different locations, and especially distance to where the food is being produced, both vegetables and livestock density, which are the 2 maps in the right-hand side. So the intensity of the yellow is where the vegetables are being produced. The intensity of red is where the livestock is. Now, having the deployment of these facilities will help enormously to be able to give them the capacity to store for a period of time and to cope with this risk and the resilience. So that's what we are trying to do on that sense. Also, we need to resolve the problems of trade. We were lucky because of the information shared by AMIS and because of the quality of the information available to minimize trade restrictions, but need to keep working on this. But in addition, we need to find ways to create a new demand for developing countries. Because most of them, like Africa, export to the Netherlands, to the UK, to the US. And to be able to create demand, one source, a significant source of demand, is inter-regional trade. Intra-regional trade will create that opportunity. And Africa has done an agreement for that. But today, for example, the share of African exports going to Africa is 21.8%. And the share of African imports from Africa is 16.4%. So there is a significant potential to increase intra-regional trade. But to do that, and to be able to get these benefits that could go from 6 billion to 20 billion, that will create an additional demand for the continent, we need to do one very important thing. Not only reduction of tariffs, because that's already agreed in the African trade agreement, but we also need to improve infrastructure, but especially to reduce non-tariff measures. Here's just an example of Kenya and Tanzania. The level of the non-tariff measures are significant. Look at the numbers. They are bigger than 20, close to 30 and 40%. And the only way we can do that is improving food safety standards. And that's why we're trying to promote with the African Union and the Ministers of Africa of Trade, the Pan-African Food Safety Agency, that will allow to improve the standards and to accelerate the process so that we can convert into reality, taking this crisis as an opportunity, the intra-Africa trade development. The same applies to the Caribbean, which is cheaper for a Caribbean island to import food from Miami or from any other country in the world than to import it from other Caribbean islands. Why? Because of the tariffs they have between them. And the same in Asia. So we need to improve interregional trade. And this is a huge opportunity, and food safety needs to be taken into consideration to reduce the non-tariff measures. Now, in the industry, things will change. This is the meat industry before and after. They are putting these plastics to separate people, to assure physical distance. But honestly, we don't think this is enough. Still, they are too close. Still, there's too much labor force there. And this is something that happens in all the packaging industry of fruits, of vegetables, of fish. The labor intensity is huge. And we need to restructure this. We need to re-engineerize this. And engineers need to think optimal situations so that we can realize physical distance. Now, this could bring, in the production side, more automatization, more robotics. But also, we know that vegetables will be grown closer to cities. That is the wave that we are observing now in Europe, and what we expect will happen across the world. Why? Because in difference to fruits and meats and so on, vegetables are the lowest level of trade internationally. They move the smallest distance because they are very perishable, very costly to move. And they can be grown in controlled environments. So there is a huge opportunity for that to happen. And that's something that we expect that will happen. Also, we expect that on the packaging and on the processing plants, automatization will play a crucial role. And here we need to be careful, because in developing countries, this is a huge source of labor demand. So we need to find ways to create also other job opportunities for those people that will be moving out of these processing plants. But clearly, the situation today has triggered the importance of automatization, like in some industry of food today. And finally, e-commerce. We are observing a significant movement towards e-commerce of food. And that requires good transportation, that requires good delivery services. But many countries, and that's what happened in China, for example, that they were ready for this, allow them to subsist during the period of the COVID-19 in Wuhan. But e-commerce will be the move. But countries need to be prepared. For example, in my country, in Peru, they couldn't do it because they didn't have a good mechanism of delivery. And therefore, when they start to do it, the delivery became informal and it created more problems. So there is a huge mechanism movement towards e-commerce that we will need to think carefully and will be in our expectation what will happen next. Thank you very much.